Last year, I sat in a seat just like this. It was my first alternatives conference. It was overwhelming. There were a lot of people. And you'd think I know how to make friends, but remember, I have a history of trauma. And isolation was a huge trigger for me. And it was so overwhelming. I did have some friends who were here, like Ty Smith and Pat Risser, and a lot of friends who were here last year, but everybody was so busy that we just didn't have a lot of time to connect. And I walked out of that lunch session and I said, well, I'm just gonna go back to my hotel room and just get myself together. But I have to think about that because so many people sit in these seats and leave away from here not connected, not having been connected to anybody. And look what happened. I didn't have a lot of voice last year, but I gained a lot of voice this year. But if we're talking about valuing every single person, if we're talking about valuing our community, then we can't let somebody leave out of this room feeling like that. And I was so blessed to be able to be nominated, to be able to speak. I was just in tears going up on stage thinking how kind of defeated I was last year walking and not having connected with anyone. And I make a lot of friends, you know that, right? I make a lot of friends. But sometimes we retreat to the familiar. Sometimes we just have to take some time to ourselves and go to ourselves. But making friends with Leah Harris over the past year and being able to speak this year is a real honor to me. It tells me that one single person can make a difference. Absolutely. And to the world, we may be one single person. But to one single person, we may be the world. If you turn to your neighbor today, don't let anybody go away from here at your table without saying hello. Let's humanize us because trauma can be dehumanizing. So let's humanize us. Let's bring a little humanity in the room. So just take 30 seconds to greet your neighbor because they may not have been greeted this morning. Just take 30 seconds and say hello to your table. They may need a hug this morning. They may need some love. I mean,
Hey. Good morning. I'm great. How are you?
I love it. Hey.
How are you doing?
Hey, William!
I didn't know you were here.
How you doing?
Good stuff.
Oh, yeah.
This is awesome. 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 Awesome, 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 awesome. I never want to be too big where I can't give a hello or somebody give a hello and a hug to me.
All right. I want to hug you. It's awesome.
Oh.
I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you for having me. Okay. And so I said, this year, I'm not going to come by myself because I could isolate myself sometimes and I can get into a retreat, and I don't want to do that. So I brought my emotional support animal. This year, I have an emotional support animal. Oh, he just jumped off. Come on, Aspen. Come on, come on. Come on up. This way, this way. Come, 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 come. He doesn't know how to get up. But anyway, this is Aspen. He's my emotional support animal. He can fly with me. He can be in the hotel. They gave me a corner room this year, thanks to National Empowerment Center. I love you. So if you want to say hello to Aspen, he's the friendliest dog, one of the friendliest dogs on earth. And he's a comfort dog, not just for me, but he's for you too. And so as I go around, he will comfort you. Let me tell you, he is a comfort dog. He will comfort you. And so thank you, Aspen. Give it up for Aspen. And Annie and Ann, they are watching out for me on that piece. So I want to hit the reset button, and I just, when we talk about trauma, yes, it can be disconnecting, it can be disruptive, it can disrupt a sense of control, connection, and meaning. That's why it's so important that we connect with one another, because we have to bring the connection back where it's lost. We have to give voice and choice where there's no control. We have to empower voice and choice. And we also talk about meaning. How do we bring meaning back to life? And so I want to hit the reset button by doing a conditioning exercise. And I love what Oryx did at the beginning to kind of get us standing up. And I just want to do one more exercise to get our heads a little clear and reset. So it does require us to stand up, but remember, you have voice and choice. If you want to sit down, you do it. All right, everybody, please stand. All right, so I'm going to give you one word, and we're going to say that word out loud 10 times. All right? So if you've played this before, play along with us. I know this crowd. So 10 times. And when we're finished, I'm going to ask you a question, and you tell me the first thing that comes to mind. All right? So I'm going to give you a word. We're going to say that word out loud 10 times. And when we're finished, I'm going to ask you a question, and you're going to tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. So the first word is spot, like on a leopard. Say spot. Just one time. Spot out loud. Spot. One more time. Spot. Let's go 10 times. Spot, 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 spot. What do you do when it comes to a green light? What do you do when it comes to a green light? What do you do when you come to a green light? I know a lot of you didn't drive here to Alternatives, but how many of you all have licenses to drive? Okay, I just want to make sure. Get the speaker out first, Oryx. Second word, white, white. You ready? Let's go. White, 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 white. What do cows drink? What do cows drink? What do cows drink in Texas? All right, one last time. What do cows drink? Water. And produce? Milk. Fabulous. Oh, I love this crowd. All right, last word. Roast, roast. You ready? Let's go. Roast, 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 roast. What do you put in a toaster? What do you put in a toaster? Have a seat, please. I missed the punchline earlier. I was going to say, since I wasn't so cool last year, I brought Aspen. He's cooler. Today's talk, I just want to give us something to think about. This isn't a comprehensive presentation. I even thwarted the PowerPoint because I don't want you to pay attention to the PowerPoint. This is some serious stuff we're talking about. And while we want to have fun in doing our jobs and we want to enjoy ourselves and have a great trip, there's also some issues on the table that we talk about and that we address that are pretty serious in the lives of those we serve and those we engage every day, including ourselves. So I wanted to talk about the impact that trauma had on my life, and I wanted to talk about pathways to healing, and I wanted to talk about what is a trauma-informed lens. I think that you've had speakers before who've talked about trauma, being trauma-informed, but I have just four points that I make about being trauma-informed that may be the same thing you've heard before or may be different. So I talked about trauma can be disruptive. It can disrupt a sense of connection and control and meaning. And that's why in my family, after my mom died, after my mom and brother were killed, I walked away from that event having lost complete voice and choice. If I had my voice, I would have said, don't kill them, please. If I had my choice, I would have said, please put down that gun. But my voice didn't matter that day. And as I went to school in the 5th grade, like my other siblings did, they went back to school, And these kids went back to school in Newtown, and they go back to school in Aurora, and they go back to school in our everyday communities when they faced violence or experienced violence. We go back to school to sometimes some shaming and humiliating practices that we do on a regular basis and have no idea that they're shaming and humiliating. For instance, I'll mention once I went to school, and in the 5th grade, the teacher asked the question, please get up and tell us your name. It was like show and tell. Tell us your name and tell us how was your summer. Well, it's a normal question. It's a regular question. I mean, we would ask that question, wouldn't we, of children? We would want to know how their summer was. But for me, my summer was hell. And I often had to dissociate or not focus on what my summer was all about. And so oftentimes I saw my own truth. That we say about children, they see their own truths. But that's what I was doing. And I had to make up things because our family strategy, like many of you all I'm sure can identify with this, our family strategy was to forget about it. In fact, a family member told me before the funeral happened, baby, she patted me on my back, and I remember her at the front door, she said, baby, pardon me, baby, you're going to have to forget about it. And I went to 5th grade trying to forget. Well, we all know that's not easy to forget. And so in the 5th grade, 6th grade, and 7th grade, I harbored those images. I didn't talk about it. I felt so isolated. I didn't talk about it with my family members. They did not want to hear about this because it was re-traumatizing. It was valid that they'd be re-traumatized talking about my mom. So we put all of her photos away, and it was like we buried her in the house too. So I didn't own a photo of her. We didn't see anything, and it was just piling it all into a chest and locking it away. Well, by the age of 13, and my friend Hugh sitting right here, we were just talking about it earlier. He's a veteran from the Vietnam War, him and his colleague there. We were just talking about this, how you ended up on a bridge wanting to take your life. Well, at 13 years old, I couldn't take it anymore. So I put my book bag on at 13, and I started walking off to school. And I looked over that bridge. I looked off, and I was going to take the leap, and I debated heaven or hell, some other things. Would I ever see my mom again? It was just so painful. She was my best friend. She was the person that I thought I was going to be able to take care of her when we got older. Those plans were thwarted. But you know what? I made it to school. I don't know what helped, but I happened at that point, but I made it to school. And I ended up couldn't concentrate in class, as many kids cannot concentrate when they're faced with these kinds of barriers. I went to class, and I couldn't concentrate in French class, and they dismissed me to Mr. Charles C. Christian's office. He was our assistant principal. And Mr. Christian, you know Mr. Christian, Leah, Mr. Christian called my grandmother at work, and my grandmother called Children's Hospital, and Children's Hospital called the school. And 3 years after those killings, they got me to the hospital, and I had been hospitalized for 30 days. For the first time ever, I would address what I've been holding back for so long. It killed me. So after I got out of that 30-day at George Washington University, 6 North, I got out of there, and they assigned me to a therapist, Christine Pierre. Christine Pierre was a social worker, and she basically, when we first started our first session, she said, instead of having it in the office, we're going to walk down to the cafeteria. So we walked down to Children's Hospital's dining room, and then she just opened up her hands like this. What do you want for lunch? Well, I'm a 13-year-old kid, lady. What do you think I want for lunch? The whole place. She didn't know that I was living in a house with 11 kids because we were displaced. We were living in Kindred Care. So we had 11 kids in that home and 5 adults. Do you know how hard it was to come by the kind of food that you're offering, lady, and just to have it by myself? Well, I went into that cafeteria that day, and I remember going over to the ice cream cone machine. And the ice cream cone machine, I built the biggest ice cream cone that you can make on this side of Earth. It was falling over like the Tower of Pisa. I was putting it back together and licking it. And I must have sat across from Christine Pierre, and I must have licked that ice cream cone for about a year. Because that's how long Miss Pierre was my therapist. I never saw her again. In fact, I remember her telling me that she wasn't going to be my therapist anymore, and how heartbreaking that was after a year. But I never saw Christine Pierre again. I remembered her name, but I just never saw her again. I never saw Mr. Christian again. I remembered him. Well, 26 years later, I sent an email marketing message out saying, these are the people who saved my life, and I think it was during Suicide Awareness Month, and I highlighted the kind of people in the community that we're talking about, Christian and Pierre and others. So I got an email back, and it said, are you talking about the same Mr. Christian that worked at Langley Junior High School? And he said to me, yes, that's him. And he said, well, that's my great uncle. He's my family member. And I said, wow, you've got to be kidding me. I said, well, is he still alive? Because it's been nearly 30 years. And I mean, he had gray hair then. I didn't know whether that's not I have a little gray hair. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I have a little bit of gray hair here. But Mr. Christian always had gray hair. And I'm thinking he must have been like really older then. So I said, well, do you have his number? And he said, well, yeah, I can give you his number. And I said, well, how old is he? He said, well, he's 86 years old. And I said, well, give me his number right away. I really need to give him a call. So I called this number, and on the other line was this raspy voice that I remembered from junior high school. And I said, hello, may I speak to Mr. Christian? He said, this is Mr. Christian. And I said, well, this is William Kellibrew. He said, hey, Billy Boy. The only person that ever called me Billy Boy in my life. I knew it was Mr. Christian. And I said, Mr. Christian, before anything happens, I want to tell you thank you so much for saving my life. If you didn't jump in that day, if you didn't have a space for me that I can sit in your office and be able to connect and have the kind of trust that we had as a school official and a student, I wouldn't have made it today. He said, well, Billy Boy, I've been watching you on television and listening to you on the radio, and I know you made it past 9th grade. Yes, Mr. Christian, I made it past 9th grade for sure. So I said, I'm on a roll here. I'm on a roll. I said, I'm going to find Christine Pierre if it's the last thing I do, because she gave me voice and choice. I'd never had voice and choice that way. Just offering me the cafeteria, she basically, that entire year, she helped build my self-confidence because I didn't feel very good about me. And that year, she helped me so much. And so I said, I've got to find Christine Pierre. And so I Googled her, and I put her name in the search engine, and of course, 501 million of them showed up. This is great, needle in a haystack. So I said, well, let me do it like the government bidding process. Let me do 3 of them and see if I can find them. I found an email in the area of Washington, D.C., and I found an email, and I emailed that person, and I just said, I hope you are the person who worked at Children's Hospital, please give me a call. Well, this person called our office, and the office called me, and they said, well, there's some Christine Pierre wants you to call her. And I said, oh, it's not just some Christine Pierre. So I called the number. I found this private moment, and I called the number. And I said, ring, ring. May I speak to Christine Pierre? And the woman on the other end said, I'm Christine Pierre. And I said, well, are you the same Christine Pierre that worked at Children's Hospital back in 1987, 1988? She said, yes, I worked there. And I said, well, wow, I'm William Kellibrew. Do you remember me? And she said, no. Well, her trauma-informed care points were going down. So she said, well, tell me a little bit about who you are. And just as a sidebar, Maya Angelou once said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And Christine Pierre said, "Tell me about who you are." And I started to tell her my story, and she interjected and said, "I know who you are. I know who you are." I said, "Really?" She said, "I remember you because I don't remember your name. I vaguely remember your face, but I remember I had to tell you something that the boundaries and procedures and the policies would not allow me to tell you. But I'm going to tell you now." And she said to me, "When you were my patient, my mom died." So every time I walked in that office, she lost her voice and choice. She couldn't tell me that her mom died, that she was so connected to me in such a way. She couldn't tell me that. But what she did was she took me down to the cafeteria and she let me have voice and choice. She gave it to me. And here we are 26 years later, 27 years later, having connected. And I said to Ms. Pierre, "Well, what was your job back then? Because I put you as a life-saving therapist." Like as a kid, there's a life-saving therapist. And she said, "Well, William," she was from Grenada, by the way, and she had this British accent. And so that's how she kind of reeled me in, because that British accent was a conversation piece even then. What Christine Pierre didn't know, that every time I left her office, I was actually going to practice that British accent every day. And I held on to that accent for as long as I could live, right? At any rate, I turn it off and on. And this is the right place to turn it off and on, isn't it? So she said to me, "I was an intern social worker. And my colleagues didn't necessarily think that I was qualified enough." Oh, go ahead. Give it up. Give it up to intern social workers, to anybody making a difference. You don't have to be the psychiatrist. You don't have to be the social worker. You don't have to be the psychologist. We can't underestimate the jobs that this receptionist plays. Because it's not about those people we're serving. It's about all of us when we're talking about trauma. Kessler in his study said that 61% of men, 51% of women in the general population have had at least one lifetime traumatic experience. Given that number, that's more than half, statistically, more than half of the room here today who've had at least one lifetime traumatic experience. The mental health system, upwards over 90%. When we're talking about the general population, over 61% of men, 51% of women. What does that tell us, though? It tells us that we must presume that everyone has had a traumatic experience so we don't get it wrong. Can you imagine if we presume that somebody has not, and they have? Well, we've misjudged. So you do two things when you presume that someone's had a lifetime traumatic experience, one lifetime traumatic experience. You do two things. One, you avoid re-traumatizing the person who's been traumatized. And number two, you do no harm to the person who has not been traumatized. Bases covered. So I went on a Carnival cruise recently. I didn't get stuck. And I didn't get stuck. And that wasn't the one I was on. And I thought everybody was a trauma survivor, from the maitre d' to the server to everybody. And so I was in the jacuzzi on top of the Carnival cruise, and this woman, she was real controlling over the space, and she's like, "Oh, you sit there, you sit there, you sit there." To me, that's a little bit of a warning sign. It's like when we lose control, we try to gain control back, and it's like we're trying to control our entire environment. Well, she was doing this, and I said, "Well, you know what? All behavior has meaning. I'm not going to judge your behavior, because if I judge your behavior, I missed the point of meaning. All behavior has meaning. When we judge behavior, we may miss the opportunity for understanding the meaning behind behavior." So when we say defiant, oppositional defiant, we say schizophrenia, we say all bipolar, we may miss the opportunity for understanding what is beyond that. Because my 6th grade teacher, bless her heart, I'm in the South, bless her heart, bless her little heart, and she wasn't meaning to be probably a nasty 6th grade teacher, but she put on my progress report in 6th grade, William is loquacious. We have to, and then I went home trying to figure out what loquacious meant, so I looked up the word loquacious, and it said talkative. Well, do you know that's how I make my money today? So what we see as a deficit in the individuals that we engage every day could very well be their strength. When we see somebody not being able to focus and concentrate and they dissociate, in fact, there's a study that says that children under the age of 10, the most commonly used strategy is dissociation. So when we consequence, what are we consequencing? Coping strategies? When we put people in the corner and turn them and face them around and say, you stand in the corner because you're talking too much, which I often had to write on the chalkboard, I will stop talking, I will stop talking, I will stop talking. Now I'm writing, I will continue to talk, I will continue to talk. Being trauma-informed is about focusing on strength-based versus deficit-based either approach or models. It's about being strength-based versus deficit-based. What's strength-based versus deficit-based? It's moving from compliance to change. Compliance to change. That's deficit-based is compliance. Strength-based is change. Another thing about strength-based, it focuses on ability versus presuming inability. We've got to change things around in this country if we're going to move toward a pathway of healing and be able to support healing for communities. And we've got to be able to connect with people and like Mr. Christian and Miss Pierre. Anybody can do this. And I'm just so honored to be here today because this is my room. This is where I thrive. You know something? And I have to thank you all because you guys have been holding down the fort. Because I've been trying to get myself together for over 20 years. And while I was doing that, you all were leading and surviving and thriving. So I want to tell you, if you haven't heard it before, and if nobody's ever told you before, I want you all the way in the back who's looking down at the paper, and I know you're listening to me, I want to say thank you. Thank you, 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 cameraman, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. If you haven't heard it before, I want you to leave feeling appreciated, and thank you so much for holding down the fort. Oryx, what time is it? You got
about 8 minutes.
8 minutes, good. So I've got 3 minutes to talk. And that's what it's about. You know, the big thing about Christine Pierre, and I'll talk about the last piece of this being trauma-informed. Trauma-informed cares about 4 points that I bring up. Number one, prevention is key. Prevention, being able to understand, to be able to see early warning signs in terms of triggers, and being able to understand when somebody may be triggered. So that's focusing on the 3 universal triggers: the feeling of loss of control, power differential, where somebody has power over another person, and number 3, lack of predictability. We're talking about those are the 3 triggers, and if we can not control people, but help people and empower individuals, then we're helping them along the healing path. So we're talking about prevention. We're talking about the prevalence. We talked about the 61% and 51% or the 90%. We're talking about the prevalence of trauma in our systems. And number 3, we're talking about recognizing and understanding the role that trauma plays in our lives, what it can do. And then, of course, it's what Christine Pierre did, which was that she used her heart. And if we operate from our heart, we'll never be wrong. We may make mistakes. We may do all kinds of things. But if we operate from our heart, we'll never be wrong. Our compassion is what brings humanity back in the room. One of the reasons why I'm alive today, because when I had a gun in my head at 10 years old, I begged for my life. I think that I have my own faith, and I believe that I prayed to God. I said, God, please don't let him kill me right there. But I also know that I'm looking down the eyes of a killer, and humanity had to come into that room, to that space. Because he killed, and I always do this in high schools. I say, Marshall, who killed my family, he served an 11-and-a-half-year prison sentence for second-degree murder on the Marine base at Quantico, Virginia, Quantico Marine Corps base. So he'd already served 11.5 years, and he got out, he met my mom and our family. So I always say that he made 99% really difficult, bad choices in that room. But he made one awesome decision, and that was not to pull that trigger that day. He didn't pull that trigger, and I lived. And I never want to think that someone can go all the way down that pathway and never can come back. And so who knows whether Marshall was a trauma survivor. I stopped hating him a long time ago, because I stopped hating him a long time ago. Could he be this 51, 61%? We've got to angle at this a little differently. Because I don't want Marshall coming home from prison not having a job, not having a family, and the community that he came from disowns him. That's what we've got to do. We've got to value every single person in our community, because that's who makes up the community.